In this series, we've learnt what makes the tide and how it's affected in the short term by the moon and the weather. In this episode, I'm going to explore the long-term effect that climate has on the tide. In the past, sea levels have been hundreds of metres higher and hundreds of metres lower than they are today, a result of the planet warming and cooling. So right now, we're going through a stage of global warming, and that means that sea levels are rising. And there are two main reasons for this. Firstly, ice is melting, both in the glaciers in the mountains and also in the Arctic and the Antarctic. And as the ice melts, it pours into the sea and rises up to sea level. And there's a second reason that's less well known, and that's that as the planet warms up, the seas are warming up, and that means that the water particles are expanding and they're taking up more space. So between the ice melting and the water expanding, scientists predict that by the end of this century, the seas could be 75 centimetres higher than they are today. That's about that much. And it doesn't sound like that much, but on one of our early episodes in Margate, episode 2, we explored that a really shallow coastline floods really quickly. So low-lying coastlines, that 75 centimetre rise will have a huge effect on the tides there. When the Romans conquered Britain 2,000 years ago, this river was the middle of a huge estuary and the land either side was underwater. Although the rise in the sea levels we're experiencing now is part of a natural cycle, it's been accelerated by the man-made heating of our planet, a direct result of the burning of fossil fuels since the Industrial Revolution of the 1800s. But it's not just the water that's changing, the land is too. In the last ice age, huge parts of the world were covered beneath heavy ice sheets, and when they melted, the release of weight meant the land that was under ice has literally floated up. So in the last ice age, Scotland was covered in ice. So let's imagine our paddle is Britain, this is northern Scotland, and that's southern Britain where we are now. So this was covered in a thick layer of ice. But then when that all melted, the effect is that Scotland started rising up like that. And because Scotland's rising, it meant the south where I am now is sinking. So you've got rising sea levels anyway, but then you've got the lands actually changing. So over here, it's going to enhance the effects of rising sea levels, whereas up here, it's going to diminish the effect of rising sea levels. Climate is essentially the long-term weather, which means that as the climate changes, so does the weather. One of the most noticeable effects is more extreme pressure differences, and in the last episode we learned that pressure has a huge effect on tides, with high pressure making lower tides and low pressure making higher tides. So with more instances of low pressure, there'll be greater risks of the higher tides known as storm surges. So this dotted line, that shows the high tide line. This is a calendar, so it's basically the same place over a month. So these are the 4 main moon phases. So these are the high tides on those moon phases. So you can see around the new moon and the full moon you've got higher high tides. Now if you add in a storm surge, which is potentially a 3-meter rise, and you add that rise onto what the tide is at that time, it shows you that the danger times are around those moon phases. So when the water is above the sea defences, so you've got these days, and then you've got these days, and you've got here. So within a tidal month, these are the danger days when you're likely to get a storm surge. Now you add on to that a 75 centimetre or up to a metre rise. When you've got the storm surge, and what that does is it extends the time of flooding to the days further out. So you've got a risk of flooding. These are the days in the tidal month, 0 up to 29. Got flooding, potential flooding. Got potential flooding. So you've got the tide as it is now, you've got more extreme low pressure systems giving you storm surges, and on top of that you've got the extra rise in the tide, which means that pretty much half the time there's a risk of low-lying coastlines being flooded. So when it comes to how climate change affects the tides, like we explored in this episode, there are 3 main factors. Firstly, you've got ice melting and the water particles expanding, which is rising the sea levels. You've also got the fact that the land is actually changing. In some places the land is rising, in some places it's sinking. And thirdly, you've got more extreme weather giving you more storm surges and those bigger short-term rises in the tide. Now in some places they won't be that affected, but where I am now, we're going to be affected by all 3 of those over the next 50, 100 years. The simple truth is that most coastlines are going to be negatively affected by rising sea levels. However, there are people around the world who are developing solutions to these challenges, turning crisis into opportunity. And this has inspired me to plan a boat trip around the world and share the stories of these people. We'll be documenting the preparations for the trip on this YouTube channel, so stay tuned.